All right, folks. Final chapter, chapter 12. We're going to talk about prison life and what it's like living in and leaving prison. Now, you've watched a couple videos by now, and you have a better feel for what it feels like or what it looks like to be incarcerated and the trials and tribulations of leaving an institutionalized experience like this and trying to reintegrate back into society. So most prisons are classified as medium security, but over half of all inmates are held in maximum security institutions. Institutions which generally hold 1,000 or more inmates are still predominant despite the outcry from penologists. 1.5 million people are presently incarcerated in the United States. As you can imagine, many of the institutions are overcrowded, and rather than focusing on rehabilitating, these institutions seem to exacerbate criminal tendencies, which we'll see. The recidivism rate of people that have, been incarcerated is higher than we would like, for sure. Imprisonment is a total experience. I've referred to this as a total institution. This means that a prisoner's life is in total control of others. Correctional officers are constantly scrutinizing inmates' behaviors. Inmates are subjected to searches, strip searches, disciplinary sanctions, you name it. The other inmates pose a threat to them, and especially a threat in reference to violence, sexual coercion, and intimidation. And as you can imagine, the most vulnerable inmates may become targets, those that are not connected with gangs in prison, those that are just roaming around by themselves, trying to keep their head low. They're extremely vulnerable in a situation like this. And that might bring up a question of how do they cope? Well, inmates adapt differently, but they learn to adapt to the prison routine one way or another. Lifestyle and activities, of course, can contribute to victimization within the system itself. There's also almost nothing that inmates will not use to victimize each other. Some inmates are victimized because they seldom get visitors, while others are victimized because they get a lot of visitors. So it's just a part of inmate life. And inmates tend to continue the same behaviors they exhibited before incarceration while they're incarcerated. Sexual coercion is a reality. Rape and coercion are customary behavior. We often see targets being young, gay, and bisexual. And we have to remember that inmates must provide regular sexual payments in return for protection. So, this idea of being coerced into sex is, for many, a strategy of protecting themselves from other threats and violences within the institution. You might ask yourself, how common is prison rape? It's difficult to gain an accurate picture of the prevalence because a lot of it's not reported. It's estimated 4% of state and federal prison inmates experienced sexual victimization, but as we can imagine, the numbers are probably higher than that. It's more likely to you're more likely to experience sexual coercion from staff than from other inmates, which is something that you might not have realized. You have to remember that most inmates are controlled almost the entire time they're in the institution. So the idea that they have all this free time to take advantage of other inmates is more a TV fantasy than it is a reality. And of course, all of the rapes and sexual violence that takes place in these institutions has certainly created some awareness, and we saw the Prison Rape Reduction Act of 2003 that was passed to address this. That act created 3 programs: a program dedicated to collecting national prison rape statistics so we could interpret the data, a program dedicated to the dissemination of information and procedures for combating prison rape, and a program to assist in funding state programs to help out. There's also a social code, as you can imagine, in a total institution like this, known as the Inmate Social Code. It refers to, one, the inmate's subculture, or the loosely defined culture that pervades prisons and has its own norms, rules, and language. There's a inmate social code, which we like to think of as an unwritten sorry about that, folks. I fast forwarded a little bit. The inmate social code is an unwritten code of behavior passed from older inmates to younger ones through socialization that serves as a guideline for appropriate behavior within the institution itself. Donald Clemmer conducted a detailed sociological study in the maximum security prison. He identified a complex social system among the inmates, a unique language, how prisoners organized into cliques, how they formed complex sexual relationships, and his most important contribution was identifying the prisonization process. This assimilation into the separate culture in prison that has its own sets of rewards and behaviors, as well as norms, rules, and language. This traditional prison culture that existed in the past is now being replaced by a violent gang culture, and it's changing the way the norms and rules and language shape the prison experience. This new inmate culture, it's an importation of outside values, and it's having a dramatic effect, especially on the prisonization process, as well as that changing inmate culture. Prisons are now way more segregated by race and ethnicity, and we see prisoners remaining very loyal to their violent street gangs that ultimately got them put into prison in the first place. Female institutions are growing, but females still only account for a small number of the incarcerated in the United States. The majority of female institutions are they're similar to college dormitories or group homes. And most women in prison have at least one child. Their children are housed with relatives or in foster care facilities, but nevertheless, it creates complications in reference to child rearing. For the most part, female inmates appear to be the same as male inmates with respect to their demographics and social experience. We see under the age of 30, more than half are high school dropouts. The average woman behind bars is poor, unskilled, has small children with health problems, and a history of abuse. They usually had a troubled family life, and about 3/4 have used drugs at some time in their lives. Female inmates are not as violent as their male counterparts. The rigid social code and inmate subculture found among male prisoners doesn't exist in female prisons, at least at this point. Often female prisoners join family groups. These make-believe families are a substitute family group. They include a faux father, mother, and siblings. They make believe that they have families, and it extends to extended family members. And of course, as you can imagine, they play their appropriate roles. And it helps female prisoners adapt to the mechanisms that operate the prison that they're incarcerated in. There's also individual and group treatment when you're in prison. You can get therapy on anger management, cognitive behavior therapy. There are faith-based programs that are available. There's drug treatment, albeit not as available as we'd like it to be. And there's HIV and AIDS treatment as well. All of these things can help inmates transition back into society. That is, if they're able to push against this new prisonization of violence and gang behavior. There's also educational programs. First prison-based educational program was in the Walnut Street Jail in 1784. Educational programs vary substantially depending on where you're at. Most institutions will help you get a GED. And we know that the more education a prisoner gets, the greater the inmate's chances are in finding suitable employment when they get out. Every state offers some form of job-related services or vocational programs. Vocational training is where these programs are usually managed within prison industries. They teach marketable skills. However, some inmates still have the difficulty of finding employment because of their criminal histories when released. Regardless of how well they have developed their skills, sometimes that record just doesn't allow you to transition the way that we would hope it does. And, of course, does rehabilitation work? In 1975, Robert Martinson published the results of his comprehensive review of prison rehabilitation programs. And he found that the majority of treatment programs are failures. Later researchers using more sophisticated evaluation tools found that rehabilitation programs do in fact work, and they work well. The difference between programs that work and those that do not appears to be related to three things. 1, the type of treatment. 2, its implementation. And 3, the nature of the offenders who have applied for the rehabilitation.